We began this study by looking at the most common reasons why people illegally immigrate to the United States. And we found that it was typically for three reasons: uh, better economic opportunities, freedom from violence, and political freedom from corrupt governments. So, uh, as far as economic opportunities and why people are coming to the United States for those, um, and how that ties into cartels and decriminalizing the drugs that fund the cartels, we looked at what happens to local economies when drug activity is heightened in that area. And what we found was typically a cartel faction moves into an area or claims that area, and they go to local business owners and basically demand a certain percentage of their profit or else. And that or else is typically violence, or threatened violence towards the business owner himself, or towards or threats of physical destruction of the business itself, or threats of violence to the business owner's family. And this is something that business owners typically um, aren't able to cope with. And they either go out of business because they're giving their money to the cartel, or they, close it um, due to the threat of violence. And what this does is, lowers the amount of jobs available for the others in the community. It takes money out of that local economy, or it doesn't allow that money to circulate within the local economy, and eventually those local economies kind of collapse in on themselves, and people who are from that area have no other choice but to move elsewhere. And in the case that a bunch of these areas are sort of getting the same treatment from the cartel, um, many people decide to attempt to come into the United States illegally to secure a job and secure a better life and more money for themselves and their family, etc. In addition to economic opportunities, um, which uh, the, the, the next reason, freedom from violence, sort of ties into that narrative that I was speaking about before. Um, when there are, mass, pretty brutal killings, um, bloodshed, and threatened violence and acted violence, many people flee that situation entirely. Um, and like I said before, if enough of the surrounding area is going through that same situation, many people decide to get out altogether, and um, try to enter the United States illegally. Lastly, many people come into the United States illegally to flee from the political corruption, and that political corruption happens much like those business owners I was referencing earlier. Um, Essentially, the cartels move in, and those demands and those bribes, which they presented to the business owners, they also present to government officials. Possibly the government officials could do more against the cartel, but when their own personal lives are being risked and are on the line, and their family's life are on the line, many of them decide to just oblige to the demands of the cartel, and essentially the the other citizens kind of get the short end of the stick, and um, many of them decide to flee. There are potential barriers to the decriminalization of really any drug, but specifically these drugs that the cartel are supplying to the United States. These are potentially dangerous drugs, potentially life-damaging drugs, and the case for decriminalization is a one that is very difficult to sell, and that is due to first the drug stigma or the stigma on drugs that exists in the United States. Um, with the war on drugs, drug use, and drug addicts, how they're depicted in media. Um, Also, the misinformation. I feel like your typical citizen, their knowledge or their drug knowledge, it's typically based in kind of these word of mouth um, communication, and they're much less um, grounded in actual scientific literature. And in addition to those things, just the general partisan disagreement with recreational drug use or drug use. You've seen it with medical marijuana and recreational marijuana. There seems to be some sort of political polarity that they they are not likely to reach any agreement on the topic whatsoever. So that is obviously a large barrier to the decriminalization of drugs. In addition to the stigma on drugs in the United States, there's also a general logistics issue. So, um, what about the people that are currently serving sentences for drug-related offenses? Let's say they were pulled over with some illicit substance and they received a felony charge and got 5 years in prison. And now with the new laws, a person in the same situation would only receive a misdemeanor or maybe some sort of mandatory evaluation or treatment. What do we do with those people that are currently serving sentences? And if we decide to retroactively implement this, um, that's a large amount of people, money, and things to move around all at once, which present an obvious barrier. Another potential barrier is cartel retaliation. You have to ask, what are the potential implications of decriminalizing these drugs, which will basically, block the flow of money, of which the cartel rely upon for day-to-day workings. How will they respond? That would be something that we would have to evaluate and determine if the risk was worth the reward. There are opportunities that arise when considering decriminalizing some drugs. One example that is related to decriminalization is the legalization of cannabis. Um, while legalization and decriminalization are two different concepts, um, cannabis was previously illegal. Once it was legalized, not only did it provide those states that legalized a ton of money through taxes, licenses, and fees, it also put a damper on the U.S.'s reliance on those drugs, cannabis in this case, that are supplied and trafficked by the cartel, thus kind of cutting that supply off of money, which the cartel use for their day-to-day activities and overall workings. Another opportunity is not necessarily a business opportunity to make money, but more to save money. So the decriminalization would provide a decrease in taxpayer spending on incarcerations for low-level drug offenses. So not only would it save taxpayer money on the entire process that goes into someone getting arrested and booked and etc., which happens quite often. It also would provide these otherwise typically law-abiding citizens the ability to still contribute to local economy if they were not incarcerated, and even more so if we strayed from incarceration and uh, kind of leaned into the direction more of treatment and things like that. Once these people were able to get treatment and kind of get that either addiction or whatever the cause of the initial drug use is, under control if they need it, then um, those people, at least on paper, it would seem that they would also be able to contribute to local economy more so than before.